Good morning, and
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us this morning.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
It is quite a time in your universe. We are in the midst of what I would call a series of shattering breakages of public trust. And I think the mood of the public, from what I can tell as a journalist, is that they actually don't know whether they can trust their technology. Breaches like Equifax, election interference, it's hard to know which front a data breach or some sort of a privacy breach might come from next. And so the broad framework of our conversation this morning is, what is the FTC's role in trying to restore that public trust, that sense of public trust, and give folks assurances that their technology is not working to harm them? So I'll start with that broad question. What can the FTC do to restore public trust at this moment?
Matt, thank you. So let me first start with a caveat that is kind of a requirement of my job, and that is what I'm going to say today is my own opinion, not necessarily the opinion of my fellow commissioners, I'm one of 5, or the commission as a whole. So let me sort of start with the following. You know, we do at the FTC a series of specific things. For over 100 years, we've done antitrust, and since the 30s, we've done consumer protection. The core of consumer protection is 2 things. It's protecting against deceptive acts and practices when people lie to you, when they break your trust in that regard. And then it's unfair, a word which has a meaning that has sort of developed over time. And then we sort of enforce a bunch of other statutes, and in particular, as we're talking about today, privacy statutes. So I think there are really 3 different things that need to happen to restore trust. The first thing I would say is that consumers need to make choices that reflect how they feel about products and services that they are using, right? If you don't like a service that you are using, it is to some extent up to you to tell the company or to move your use of the service or whatever elsewhere. That's not the whole of the solution, but it's an important part of it. I was in Brussels a few months ago for a meeting of what's called the ICDPPC. It's sort of the gathering of data protection and privacy commissioners from around the world. This is in Brussels. We're months after the passage of GDPR. And what's the topic? The topic is not spiking the football on GDPR. It's digital ethics. And what are digital ethics? Digital ethics are an exploration not just of what the law ought to be, and not just what law enforcers ought to do, but really spreading awareness, spreading standards throughout the market, including to consumers, so that when people make choices, they do it in a more deliberate way. So that's thing number 1, consumers. Thing number 2, of course, firms, right? Firms are, and you're beginning to see this in the market, I hope, speaking more openly, owning what they're doing, and trying to lend greater transparency. We can talk about whether it's enough in a few minutes, but that's a really important part of the process. You begin to see firms talking about privacy very publicly. You saw it just 2 days ago, and trying to explain to consumers, look, here's what we're offering, and here's why it's either good for you or not so bad for you. But the third leg of the stool is government, right? And I think we need to be a part of that discussion. We need to engage with the public and explain what we're doing. We need to explain what our authorities are. We need to explain what they're not. And I think all of that together, consumers as a force, firms as a force, and government as a force, hopefully can help restore public trust.
So we're at this moment where some of the heads of the firms, Mark Zuckerberg himself, is taking to the Washington Post, hat in hand, coming to the government and saying, regulate me. Give me some regulations. And he's citing a need for government guidance, standards, and enforcement in 4 areas in the Post: harmful speech or harmful, hateful content, election interference and particularly election advertising, privacy, and data portability. privacy is the interesting part there, because he's asking.
It's all pretty interesting.
It's all pretty interesting, but for your purposes and for the purposes of our conversation this morning, Mark Zuckerberg is asking for the U.S. to build upon the framework established by the GDPR. To go back to my point about trust, a lot of folks are cynical about that request. How do you build a regulatory framework that doesn't lock in the advantages of first movers like Facebook? Or
So,
third movers, to respect to MySpace and Friendster.
some of us were on those sites.
Yes.
I think that is the hardest question that Congress is dealing with right now. Right? I think people understand, first of all, that when we talk about privacy legislation, we are not just talking about two firms, right, or 3 firms or 4 firms. We are talking about what some people describe as the fourth industrial revolution. The collection of, the use of, the monetization of data is everywhere in the economy. It is not just tech firms, right? All firms are tech firms now, or many firms are tech firms now. It's IoT, it's driverless cars, whatever. So you're talking about legislating in a continually evolving part of the economy and a growing part of the economy. And you don't want to have those effects, right? You don't want to stifle innovation. And you don't want to stifle competition. How to do that, I think, is the most important question that we have. But I think we need to start in the following place. I think we need to decide first and foremost, what are we solving for, right? So when you think about the balance between innovation and what you're trying to prevent, you have to have in mind what you are trying to prevent. So, think about environmental regulation. People sort of looked around in the 1970s, Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, they saw 3 Mile Island and things like that, and they said, that's bad, I want to stop that. What I want Congress to do, and what I've said to Congress is, before you decide on the tools, before even you decide on what the liability standards are, what's in and what's out, come together and figure out what are the problems I'm trying to solve. And the reason this is difficult, I think, is because privacy is a nebulous term. It means different things to different people. So the NTIA at the Commerce Department did a study a little while back, and they surveyed American consumers. What do you think about when you think about privacy? Number one answer, I don't want data about me to go to bad guys, right? To firms or people that I don't know or trust, and who are going to do me harm. So that's kind of a data breach thing. But that's not all we talk about when we talk about privacy. We talk about consumer awareness. We talk about empowerment. Maybe we're talking about data portability. What I want Congress to do is sit there, think about all that innovation, which is really important. Think about competition. And then on the other side of the ledger, first decide what are the problems we want to solve, and then let's have a discussion how best to solve those problems. Because I worry, if you try to solve a problem that you haven't first defined, first, right, you might not solve that problem. And second, you might end up in a scenario where you're creating problems you didn't intend to create.
So a criticism that's been made of the FTC in particular is that, in fact, it's had an attitude of too much, let's hold hearings, let's try to actually discuss the harms. And that in the meantime, in that deliberative process, the world has moved on to a point where a hand has been forced. GDPR is now in effect in the EU. The state of California has passed the California Consumer Protection Act. China is taking its own attitude towards data collection and use. And that now, part of the reason that we're discussing the possibility of federal legislation in an otherwise pretty gridlocked Congress is that our hand is effectively forced, that legislation, that there is a big cry from all quarters within the U.S. on comprehensive federal legislation to address some of the trenchant questions that have become emergencies for folks. Folks will often say, critics of the past decade or so of action at the FTC will often say that this is the role of the regulatory agencies, that in fact the law is always going to lag behind innovation. It's always going to be behind the setting of standards, and that it's on the FTC as our primary governmental guardian of privacy to be trying to, as much as possible, dive into the nuances, keep up with what's changing, and act in accordance. Do you think that there's any way that legislation can keep pace with the range and variety of the challenges consumers are facing?
So a short answer to the question is, of course, it's really difficult for legislation to keep pace with dramatic change. That probably is part of why we in the United States have the dramatic change that we have. We're not so quick to just jump and stamp out market forces. One of the worries I have with some of the criticism you're describing is the notion that we at the FTC ought to sit around and be like a little mini legislature, right? We are 5 people, and we get nominated and confirmed and all that, but at the end of the day, we're not elected. We're not responsible to the people. And even if we're all really smart and well-meaning people, and I think, at least with one exception, we are, I think I'm well-meaning, we're not in a good position by dint of who we are and where we are in the world to make fundamental value choices. We can certainly help Congress along. There's a really good history of the FTC doing what you were saying before, looking at things, studying things, and saying, hey, Congress, take a look at what we just found. We did a big report on data brokers, is a good example of this. And sometimes Congress acts, and sometimes it doesn't. We actually did this with privacy a while back. But what we're not really well equipped to do is to legislate. And I think that's really a role that Congress needs to have.
How about enforcement in the areas where the law's been set, the standards have been set? This has been another criticism of the FTC, that it's actually moved really haltingly to enforce in cases where there seem like clear violations of FTC policies. Take Facebook's consent order, the consent order against Facebook from 2011. There were all sorts of arguments, and the FTC has been looking into the arguments that Facebook violated that consent order. And what does that say about the FTC's capability to enforce when Congress does say, here's what the law is?
So let me say 2 things. The first is that I think we do need to listen to the criticisms that are being made. I think we need to evaluate them, and where we feel we're falling short, or where others feel we're falling short, it's up to us to explain what we're doing and why we're doing it. I don't want to speak to any particular case. I do want to say the following. You can read something in the news and think, that's got to be wrong, and something needs to be done ASAP. We do law enforcement, and that means we need to build cases, and that sometimes can take time. Can it be frustrating? Sure. But it still, if you want to do law enforcement right, often takes time.
And when even a subcommittee of the FTC says, act against, here's a clear case for an enforcement action, and makes recommendations to the commission, as they did for Google in 2013, is it then incumbent? Do you think that the FTC should, in this environment, have a more aggressive posture of enforcement? At that time, in 2013, the commission decided against acting on the recommendations of the unanimous recommendations of its subcommittee on the question of whether Google was using monopoly power essentially to push its competitors around. Do you think that the FTC erred in that case, and should it be more aggressive about enforcement looking ahead?
So I don't want to speak to an issue about which there's a lot of non-public information. Just so everyone understands what we're talking about, the way the FTC works is we have these constituent bureaus. Those are the staff, and depending on the issue, they will send up recommendations. They don't always agree on things. It's our job as commissioners fairly to evaluate for law and also for policy, right? What are the actions that we as the commission need formally to take? And that's true for the direction of any law enforcement agency, right? Recommendations come up, and you exercise prosecutorial discretion. My sense is that we are all committed to enforcing the laws that Congress passes. There will be little differences that you will see over time. They'll become public about how we viewed a particular issue, but I think everyone is committed, where there are violations of the law, to enforcing it.
So in one moment, I'm going to turn to the audience for questioning, but I wanted to ask you, we've been sticking pretty close to the subject of privacy. You also, as a commissioner, have some things to say about antitrust and the question of whether the platforms have gotten too big. How are you going to approach answering those questions? How do you apply antitrust law as it's been established in other domains to the tech sector now?
So the nice thing, or one of the nice things to me about antitrust law, is that it is a law of more general applicability. It operates across a variety of sectors, high tech, low tech, and it's done so for, since 1890. That's when the Sherman Act was passed. There have been developments, right, in how the law is interpreted and applied by courts and by agencies like ours and the Department of Justice. But it is a law of general applicability. The tricky things with the tech sector are that we need to understand best we can how conduct is operating in markets that may not be as intuitively obvious. Right? So we need to know what's going on, and then we need to see how does it relate to the law as we understand it. The particularly tricky part of that is that in more dynamic markets, and in markets where you may have network effects, sort of winner-take-all situations, where are we looking for the competition? If competition is occurring earlier in the development of the firm, or people are buying small competitors that then will rise, how do you fit that within the antitrust framework, within the law that we have?
Let's turn to the audience for a question over here.
Hi, my name is Drew Clark with Broadband Breakfast. I wonder if you could speak to the issue of how privacy legislation might interact with net neutrality legislation. Obviously, there is a measure on the Hill right now. It'll be marked up in the House Commerce Committee tomorrow. Is there any sense that whether that measure or another subsequent measure that has more bipartisan support, do you think that that gets attached to privacy? How do you see privacy playing out on the Hill from your vantage point down Pennsylvania Avenue?
So I spent 7 years working on Capitol Hill, and the most important lesson that I learned was not to prognosticate on what's going to happen. I don't know the answer to that question. My rough sense of the world is that net neutrality questions have been a little more, or a lot more, the subject of sort of partisan bickering, whereas there does seem to be broader agreement that we ought to do something on privacy.
I wanted to just follow up by asking specifically about privacy. You mentioned that identifying consumer harms should be sort of the first guidepost. It should be a compass point for figuring out what sort of legislation we should create to address those harms, and also what sort of regulatory framework might help unwind them in the moment. But some of you cited a study earlier that said that folks generally don't know. They don't have transparency about what's being done with their data. Data and Society did a recent study that said that low-income Black and brown Americans were some of the folks who were most concerned about their privacy. But the part of the nature of that concern is that they don't actually, they can't anticipate the various ways that their data might be used against them. So it might be that location tracking is used against me in a police case. How do you identify consumer harms when the consumers don't actually have enough visibility into the platforms to know what harms might befall their data?
So let me first draw what I think is an important distinction embedded in at least part of your question. And that is, we use, again, the word privacy. It means a lot of different things to different people. In the United States, under our Constitution, there's one particular kind of privacy that is treated very differently. And actually, let me step back for a minute. So in Europe, the right to privacy vis-a-vis both the government and private actors is a fundamental human right. Right? That's embedded in the Charter, and GDPR and the directive that preceded it follow from that. That is not how we have traditionally approached consumer privacy in the United States. Privacy vis-a-vis the government becomes a whole different issue. Right? That's sort of Fourth Amendment land. We've got a bunch of statutes built on the Fourth Amendment, FISA and ECPA and what have you, that govern part of that interaction, right? And that also goes to when data are shared with firms, with private firms, what right does the government have then to get it from them and under what circumstances? That's been a huge matter of debate in the Congress. Let me get back, though, to your question and say sort of two things. The first is that, to me, part of what's going on right now in the national conversation in the United States is that consumers across the board are becoming somewhat more aware of how data are being, and data in particular about them, are being used in the economy. Not everyone is fully aware. I'm not fully aware. This is, there's a term in like political science, they call it rational ignorance, right? So voters famously, like if you remember the late night shows, they would go out onto the street in New York and ask you like, who's the vice president? And you get these silly answers. It's not that the people they were asking were stupid, not at all. It's that they may not, as they go about their day-to-day lives, have a reason to invest a lot of time and effort, a lot of money, in learning all the things that there are to know. They can often rely on heuristics, right? So I, care a lot about free markets, so I'm a Republican, right? And maybe I don't need to go much deeper than that. I think there is both a lot that consumers don't know, right? And would like to know. There are also some things that consumers don't know because the cost of learning it is just too great. And so you see the 70 pages of legalese with your privacy policy. So I think that there are limits to this, but we are in a process of people learning. And part of the discussion I think that is being had on the Hill is, are there things the government can do that ought to kind of bring to light a little more information, or maybe even standardize, right? I don't really know a lot about the content of the food that I eat, but I know how to access it. And I even know how to look at two different boxes of food and very quickly compare, right? So that's an example of how you might look at a regulation and say, well, that's a useful way to convey to those consumers who wish to know what some differences in privacy policies are.
Noah, thank you very much for
Thank
your
you
answers this morning and for joining us.